Good evening. I want to welcome you to our last week of the NEH lecture series. We have a real treat in store for us tonight. This treat started several years ago when I was tasked with putting together an invited panel for an O'Connor session at an American Literature Association meeting. I knew we needed some sure drawing cards, and having read a little of Dr. Davis's work, I believed she could do that. So with the audacity of youth, I boldly called her, asking her to take part in a discussion of a temple of the Holy Ghost. I heard half of the response that I expected. The half I didn't expect was when she almost immediately and excitedly told me that temple was one of her favorite stories. But of course, there came the other shoe. My schedule is already too booked for such an event. But I remembered, and when it came time to start thinking about our lecturers for the NEH this summer, I gave her another phone call. She was a little hesitant at first, and we began to talk, and we found out we had a mutual admiration in Patricia Yeager, who had been at my first NEH Summer Institute, and who was a good friend of Dr. Davis. An admiration rooted in Patsy's unflinchingly original brand of scholarship and her charisma as a scholar. I truly believe that if Professor Yeager were here, she would be very excited to be here and very excited to hear Dr. Davis. Certainly, few scholars could come to us with as many accolades. Professor Davis is currently Geraldine R. Siegel Professor of American Social Thought Emerita and Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in African American literature and Southern literature with an emphasis on issues of race, region, and gender. Her research interests are interdisciplinary: geography and African American writers, photography and Southern women, film and literary modernism, visual culture and the Harlem Renaissance, civil rights law, and narrative fiction. She's the author of the Discipline Shaping Southscapes, Geographies of Race, Region, and Literature from 2011, Games of Property, Law, Race, Gender, and Faulkner's Go Down Moses from 2003, Nella Larson, novelist of the Harlem Renaissance from 1994, and Faulkner's Negro, Art and the Southern Context from 1982, as well as the editor of numerous reference texts, including the Penguin Classic editions of Nella Larson's Passing and Quicksand, and the co-edited Satire or Evasion, Black Perspectives on Huckleberry Finn. She has most recently published a monograph on Alice Walker for the Understanding Contemporary Author series, and serves as the co-editor of the Gender and American Culture series from the University of North Carolina Press. She has taught widely and lecturing in Europe and in Asia, delivering papers at the International Faulkner Symposium in Japan, and making a keynote address at the English Language and Literature Association of Korea. As the Walt Whitman Chair in American Civilization, a Fulbright Distinguished Chair at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, she participated in American study programs throughout Western and Central Europe. And she's held tenured professorships at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Brown University, and Vanderbilt, where she was the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor of English. She's also invested in contemporary archival work. She's been a fellow at the Newberry Library in Chicago, the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, and the Huntington Library in California, where she held the R. Stanton Avery Distinguished Fellowship. During 1914 through 15, she was the Director's Fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. I could go on listing just her most recent articles and book chapters, her service on editorial boards, and even her work as a poet. But I want to leave time for you to hear from her for yourself. It is a tremendous honor to present to you Professor Thaddeus Davis.
Many, many thanks to Professor Donahue for that fulsome introduction. But I want to especially thank him and Professor Bruce Gentry for inviting me. This is a special honor to be here with you. And I want to thank Christina Osteed for her expertise and technical assistance in setting all of this up for me. So Being here is a pleasure. It's an honor. I'm so glad to see all of you and to learn more about the work that you're doing on O'Connor. I will not feel badly if I notice that you're nodding off, because you can do that and wake up and you will not have missed a beat in the way that I tend to present things. So at any rate, this is Framing Visual Spatiality, Scripting Spatial Geographies, and it is a start that I'd like to make that may seem a bit different. It's Flannery O'Connor in Iowa City, 1946-1947. So I think that's a transitional moment for her and for thinking about her work. I'm located in the margins. I make a definite distinction between that marginality which is imposed by oppressive structures and that marginality one chooses as site of resistance, as location of radical openness and possibility. This site of resistance is continually formed in that segregated culture of opposition that is our critical response to domination. We come to this space through suffering and pain, through struggle. We know struggle to be that which pleasures, delights, and fulfills desire. We are transformed individually, collectively, as we make radical creative space which affirms and sustains our subjectivity, which gives us a new location from which to articulate our sense of the world. Bell Hooks choosing the margin as a space of radical openness. I'm intrigued by the possibilities inherent in thinking about Bell Hooks' statement on choosing a spatial location of openness and possibility and applying it outside of the parameters she intended in writing on race and space and gender, in Yearning, Race, Gender, and Cultural Politics. What if we reposition Flannery O'Connor in the margin as a radical creative space which affirms and sustains? From that space, then, O'Connor theoretically achieves a location from which to articulate her sense of the world. This may seem a rather odd way to begin a consideration of a white woman writer who was resistant to the modern political reordering of spatial spaces in the American South, and dismissive of blacks in the struggle to achieve racial equality in those very spaces. I begin in this way, nonetheless, to expand readings of O'Connor, placing her in a space that Hooks delineates for herself as a black feminist woman, basically unsettles O'Connor as a white non-feminist woman, but retains her subjectivity and locational identity. It makes her hyper-visible, however, within context of her own making. From her earliest drawings and cartoons through her final stories, O'Connor articulated an insistence on the visual, the seeing and the seen. She framed a visual spatiality that charted a specific presence and social identity, an insider-outsider location imbricated in social relations, yet fomented in creativity that enabled a distinct subjectivity. In explaining her position on marginality, Hooks claims, quote, I was naming a central location for the production of counter-hegemonic discourse that is not just found in words, but in habits of being and the way one lives. As such, I was not speaking of a marginality one wishes to lose, to give up, but rather as a site one stays in, clings to even, because it nourishes one's capacity to resist. It offers the possibility of radical perspectives from which to see and create, close quote. For Hooks, then, the space in the margin is a site of creativity and power, but also of resistance, in that it is both an intervention and an inclusive space where one can recover oneself. She understands that the margins have been both sites of resistance and sites of oppression. She understands, too, that the margins are worth sitting in, standing in, being in. Her subjective words, when set in motion to locate O'Connor, reverberate with the consciousness of difference. Yet, at the same time, those very words offer the possibility of revisioning and here thinking about Flannery O'Connor herself, made visible, recognizing her difference, and in much of her short life, placing herself in a position of observable visuality and creative spatiality, even though radical is not a term easily applied in the traditional sense to O'Connor. It may be a leap to contextualize O'Connor in this way, but factor in much of what we know about her religious beliefs, her theological underpinnings, and her worldview of Catholicism, and there indeed seems to be in her politics of location and her perception of self a claim to a spatial conception of difference and of social and religious justice, though not necessarily racial justice. Writing in a different but parallel vein of locating O'Connor, Timothy J. Baselin charts the toll of lupus on her body and work by starting out with a quote of O'Connor's from, a quote by O'Connor from The Habit of Being. And it is, "I have never been anywhere but sick. In a sense, sickness is a place more instructive than a trip to Europe. And it's always a place where there's no company, where nobody can follow. Sickness before death is a very appropriate thing, and I think those who don't have it miss one of God's mercies." While Baselin focuses on the aspect of God's mercies as a summation of O'Connor's statement and her uniqueness among modernist writers, I would call attention specifically to her identification of sickness as a place she occupies in a being alone, separated by and into this place. Place, in this instance, is another way of understanding O'Connor's corporeal positionality. Her place, or what I'm here linking to a place on the margin, which she describes as more instructive than a trip to Europe. While not a choice on her part, it offers a location from which to affirm and sustain her subjectivity, and from that location to articulate not only her creativity, but also her sense of the world, both of which she indeed chose. Some time ago, critics of Southern literature gravitated to conceptions of place as a way of articulating the distinctiveness of writing the South, especially in relation to historical time, periods reviewed and viewed through the lens of modernism. We can think immediately of William Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha or Ernest Gaines's Bayonne. While time studies has recently developed exponentially as a field attending to contemporaneity, it is, in a sense, a reimagining of the concerns with time and history critics expounded in the throes of modernism following the World War I generation. With postmodernism emerging out of the post-war World War II era and the second half of the 20th century, there has been the adjacent recognition that events occur in space and not merely in time, so that postmodern critics such as Hooks, Edward Soha, and Frederick Jameson, for instance, move to contextualize place in relation to space. Jameson, who theorized out of the Marxist tradition, emphasized that in order to understand contemporary conditions and cultural production, spatial issues are necessary as a fundamental concern which does not ignore the difference, ignore the significance of time. For Jameson, that recognition called for a new kind of spatial imagination capable, he said, of confronting the past in a new way and reading its less tangible secrets off the template of its spatial structures: body, cosmos, city. That move to body, cosmos, city as a spatial structure facilitated a renewed emphasis on experience, or the various modes through which a person knows and constructs a reality. These modes, according to Yi-Fu Tuan, range from the more direct and passive senses of smell, taste, and touch to active visual perception and the indirect mode of symbolization. Visual perception, like the experiential perspective, requires interaction with the world, with the externality of things, people, places, but it also encompasses an internal dynamic or felt component. This emphasis on vision, on seeing, is a recognizable aspect of O'Connor's creative process. I label it her spatial imagination and link it to her experience of place, how she constructs a reality that she transcribes into her fiction. In distinguishing between place and the more abstract space, Tuan has written, quote, "From the security and stability of place, we are aware of the openness, freedom, and threat of space. If we think of space as that which allows movement, then place is a pause. Each pause in a movement makes it possible for location to be transformed into place." Rather than exploring Flannery O'Connor's place as a Southerner or her South as place and pausing her movement in time, here I'm concerned with her experience of space, its openness, freedom, and threat in the experience of movement. To be more specific, parsing space as abstract, Tuan acknowledges in body personal relations and spatial values that space is an abstract term for a complex set of ideas. However, he writes, if we look for fundamental principles of spatial organization, we find them in two kinds of facts: the posture and structure of the human body and the relations, whether close or distant, between human beings. Close quote. That is to say, human beings, out of an intimate experience with their own human body or with interacting with other people, organize space so that it conforms with and caters to their biological needs and social relations. Tuan's understanding, then, is that the body is in space and takes up space. While body connotes lived body, space, on the other hand, is humanly construed space. That is, humans impose a schema on space by their mere presence. I want to contextualize O'Connor in relation to humanly construed space, to the notion that in organizing space, she conformed it to her own biological and psychological needs and to her social relations in a cartography of whiteness. That cartography, part of her spatial visuality and experiential perspective, repeatedly maps small town, rural, country, southern places in relation to gender, identity, and subjectivity. Here, without repeating and delineating the known facts, I take into account O'Connor's situational biography, white, racial designation, only child upbringing, Southern Catholicism location, women's college educational environment, paternal circumstantial legacies including illness and death, extended matriarchal family milieu, and small farm and small town environments. The schema she imposes on spatiality is what I am calling a framing of visuality, and with it, a concomitant seeing of self, distinctly, and authoritatively. This framing of visuality allows for a mapping of body, cosmos, city as spatial structures, as Jameson projected, for opening up a reading of experience with O'Connor situated in the margin in a radical creative space which affirms and sustains O'Connor's own subjectivity and which provides a location from which to articulate her sense of the world and to script its spatial geographies. 2, Flannery O'Connor began drawing as a young child and became more prolific when she entered Peabody High School in 1940. While in high school and later in college, Georgia State College for Women, She contributed more than 100 cartoons and other images in linoleum cuts to student publications and the Alumni Journal, so that she was known as the Cartoon Girl during her college days. As Kelly Gerald put it, O'Connor's early work as a cartoonist remains a largely unacknowledged aspect of her creative life. Gerald set out to change that. She's called attention to O'Connor's emphasis on seeing and looking as foundational, and she's highlighted O'Connor's writing about the habit of art as a concept and undergirding her work. O'Connor indeed stressed vision in her essay, Writing Short Stories, maintaining that, quote, everything has a testing point in the eye, and the eye is an organ that eventually involves the whole personality, as much of the world as it can be got into. This explanation was central to O'Connor's understanding of the writer's process. Gerald applies that very explanation to the habits O'Connor developed early on as a visual artist working as a cartoonist. Quote from Gerald, she discovered for herself the nuances of practicing her craft in a medium that involved communicating with images and experimenting with the physical expressions of the body in carefully choreographed arrangements. Her natural proclivity for capturing the humorous character of real people and concrete situations to rudimentary elements she later asserted formed the genesis of any story, found expression in her prolific drawings and cartoons long before she began her career as a fictional writer. Close quote from Gerald. I want to extend Gerald's astute observations into the realm of spatial awareness and visual spatiality, and to provide a frame for visual spatiality in her scripted geographies. The practice and drawing of cartoons depends on a specific attention to spatial parameters and on the framing or enclosure of any action, character, or idea within a designated space. Even the extended cartoon of the comic strip, for instance, appeared in only 4 panels. This very conscious and necessary attention to space is key to understanding delineation, representation, containment, and compression. The hand and the eye work in tandem, but within a specified space that is limited and finite as well as defined. Part of the process for the cartoonist that may go unobserved is this element of space. With a focus on delineating her subject by framing it in visual space, O'Connor draws upon a mode of representation that relies heavily upon containing her subject within a defined geography and compressing both action and thought within that geography. Compression then becomes a part of O'Connor's habit of mind. The cartography of O'Connor's cartoons in her overall career as a writer of fiction has much to do with spatial considerations as much to do with spatial considerations as with the drawing of figures, though the particular valences of the drawings situated well within the technical world of comics and cartoons are significant and also quite observable. There are obviously multiple contemporary models of comic drawings that would have been available to O'Connor. Gerald rightly describes the stylistic and visual influence of James Thurber, cartoonist and humorist who was often in the pages of the New Yorker, and of W.C. Fields and Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, popular film comedians. I call attention here to the additional fact that cartoons from O'Connor's childhood and young adulthood coincide with the golden age of comics from 1925 to 1954. Recall that in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, the 8-year-old John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, and his sister June Starr read the funny papers on the floor of their house before their trip to Florida. And later in the car, they exchanged comic books. Only when they had finished all the comic books they had brought do they turn their attention to lunch. The significance of the funny papers and comics to children is not lost on O'Connor, who experienced this golden age during her own childhood and youth. O'Connor was most actively drawing cartoons during the height of popularity for comic strips and newspapers, and the rise of animated cartoons that joined their ranks in entertaining mass audiences. Even William Faulkner, early on a visual artist of cartoons, found visual inspiration, especially for Light in August, in the 1930s animated Mickey Mouse films that took on the world in disguised terms. With the emphasis on visualizing the mouse, the viewer watches and learns from the scene with little attention to talk and sound. As I've observed of Faulkner's connection to Steamboat Willie, November 1928, the third of the Mickey Mouse cartoons following Plain Crazy, August 1929, and The Galloping Gaucho, August 1928, quote, "The former properties of producing animation attracted Faulkner, who absorbed all the new techniques for experimenting with construction of a prose text." So I'm quoting from myself, my own work on visualizing Light in August. I suspect that in her shift to writing fiction while at Iowa, O'Connor too absorbed reflexively the properties of animation and brought them with her in that transition. The properties of animated film and comic strips are interrelated. The two forms, print and animated, share a recognizable visual identity. The heavy use of black ink on white backgrounds and exaggerated facial features in the early ink blot cartoons emphasized the compressed space of those comic strips. Much of this technique is visible in the ink blot cartoons O'Connor contributed to the Peabody Palladium. While the newspaper comics could only suggest movement from one frame to the next, animated cartoons could capture and depict motion. Noticeably, while O'Connor's single-page drawings often indicate or evoke movement, her stories delineate characters in motion through space, such as the grandmother, Hulga, the child, or Parker, moving in developed animated sequences that utilize that motion to advance the narrative. Some of the more recognizable examples of animated cartoons include ones that are very familiar to you: Tom and Jerry, Betty Boop, Felix the Cat, Mickey Mouse, initially entitled Steamboat Willie, Tweety Bird, and Popeye. These popular visual animations are representations of bodies, often anthropomorphous, animals with human traits, foibles, and vocabularies rendered as comic, lent a certain credibility to allocating the human body to cartoon-like spatialities that could routinely have violence done to it or perpetrated upon it without the consequences of actual maiming or permanent damage done to the body. Betty Boop, for example, was originally drawn as a French poodle, anthropomorphic, and it was only a year later that she actually took on a human form. In her stories, O'Connor visualizes the body in categories, race, gender, class, that often register in cartoon-like, in at once magnifying objects, identifying traits, and producing a reductive, obscured subjectivity. Even though characters are animated, vividly, even unforgettably described in a few piercingly accurate and searingly memorable words that function like captions. The opening of Good Country People introduces Mrs. Freeman in this suggestive way, quote, "Besides the neutral expression that she wore when she was alone, Mrs. Freeman had two others, forward and reverse, that she used for all her human dealings. Her forward expression was steady and driving like the advance of a heavy truck. Her eyes never swerved to left or right, but turned as the story turned, as if it followed a yellow line down the center of it. She never used the other expression because it was not often necessary for her to retract a statement. But when she did, her face came to a complete stop. There was an almost imperceptible movement of her black eyes, during which they seemed to be receding. And then the observer could see that Mrs. Freeman, though she might stand there as real as several grain sacks thrown on top of each other, was no longer there in spirit." Objectively described as truck-like in her expression and movement, the rub is that it is all on the surface of the scene, particularly her eyes dominating her face and determining motion. This description of a human being could easily be imagined as the opening drawn panels of a comic strip with captions or an animation with caricatures opening out to a story. While Mrs. Freeman is a character rendered to magnify her comic traits and deflate her human body as mechanical truck or inanimate grain sacks, the drawn correspondence between the human and animal body in cartoons and animations provoked humor without having to account for real danger or hurt done to the human being. The upshot is a focus on the animality of the human, which, as often seen in O'Connor's fiction, reduces the potential for empathy with animal-like humans and ignores or obscures the elements of pain and suffering, physical or psychological, done to the human body. Violence is casual and causal, even when lasting in trauma, as in Helga's leg being shot off in Good Country People, or when resulting in death, as in A Good Man is Hard to Find. O'Connor renders pain and suffering without affect or emotional trauma of pain's physical or psychological wound. In A Good Man is Hard to Find, against a stark background of woods, tall, dark, and deep, the grandmother's sudden loss of her entire family, her son Bailey, his wife, their baby, and their two older children, John Wesley and June Starr, in violent deaths in the woods, is mitigated by her inability to recognize and feel the pain of the deaths. And because the form of the narrative allies the reader most closely with the grandmother's perspective, though not necessarily with her moral compass, thank God, there is an acceptance of the comic reduction of the family. The children's mother, for example, is nameless and has a face that, quote, was as broad and innocent as a cabbage and tied around with a green headkerchief that had 2 points on top like rabbit ears, close quote. The insertion of cabbage and green and rabbit together in the compact description draws out the animal comparison, and without a given name, she is reduced to the biological space of being the mother, a reproductive function also found in animals. Similarly, once the nameless, relationally identified grandmother is compared to an animal, she remains stuck in that comparison. Quote, the grandmother raised her head like a parched old turkey hen crying for water. The misfit's lack of emotion at the stark violence perpetrated and his dispassionate assessment of the grandmother further play into the idea that, reduced in their humanity by the comic elements of their shortened trip and their descriptions, the family's suffering in the end is obliterated because they had already been reduced to the equivalence of cartoon creatures. It is a flipping of the visual script on anthropomorphic. In exploring animality, its covers, and transcendence, Yu Fu Tuan asks the question, can one take flight from one's own corporeal wrappings? He begins to posit an answer by stating, quote, the very idea is science fictional, yet we do it often, imaginatively, as in daydreams, or when we become wholly absorbed in some other person, object, or event, close quote. Here I think of the child in A Temple of the Holy Ghost, whose obsession with the two teenage visitors shapes her daydreams that O'Connor does not separate from her waking reality. She's even more animated in her dreams than she is in laughing at the bodily shortcomings of Mr. Cheat and Alonzo. When asked how she knows so much about Wilden and Corey, the boys drafted to escort Joanne and Suzanne to the fair, and who were described as, quote, sitting like monkeys, their knees on a level with their shoulders and their arms hanging down between, the child lay back on the bed and began to count the narrow boards on the ceiling until she lost her place. I know them all right, she said to someone. We fought in World War together. They were under me, and I saved them 5 times from Japanese suicide divers. And Wendell said, I am going to marry that kid. And the other said, "Oh, no, you ain't, I am." And I said, "Neither of you is, because I will court-martial you all before you can bat an eye." The compressed daydream is akin to a comic strip, replete with dialogue scripted like captions accompanying the images. It is as well a reminder of O'Connor's early cartoons unmasking of femininity and depicting the military women housed at her college and the tensions over ways of being that she depicted in dress and demeanor. In her daydream, the child escapes her own body, and though still referred to as that kid, she does not have an explicit gender identity, only the implied masculinity, maleness of soldiers, and she becomes not any ordinary soldier, but the heroic one of higher rank, so that she saves Corey and Wendell Wilkins and is their commanding officer. The Wilkins have, coincidentally we can say, commanded her real-life attention, even though she does not interact with them directly in the outdoor space, but rather observes them from a safe distance, quote, on a barrel pushed into some bushes at the side of the house. O'Connor signals that the space created in the interactions between the child and the teenagers in the bedroom is a productive space for the dream. That space signifies that individuality and interdependence work together. The imaginative sequences attributed to the child depend upon not simply her affective dimensions, which means that she is and becomes aware of her corporal reality, but her own body, aware of her own body and that of others, the girls, her mother, the boys, Miss Kirby and her suitor, and also the man-woman from the sideshow, all constituting a cosmos she inhabits. In a sense, if the child, like O'Connor, in the hypothetical positioning on the margin here, occupies the space in the margin, then she functions in what Hooke's terms a site of creativity and power, but also of resistance and intervention and an inclusive space where she recovers herself, where we too move in solidarity to erase the category colonizer and colonized. Or, in this case, in leveling the hierarchical distinction and power dynamic between childhood and adulthood. Notice that the child assumes to possess the knowledge of adulthood, sexuality, and reproduction unavailable to the older girls who press her for the information. She reverses the power dynamic in leveling a cunning, though innocent and fanciful, conception of birth. The older girls, in their ignorance, cannot refute her testimonial of superior knowledge, her supposedly eyewitness account to the birth of rabbits through the mouth. Not only, then, is the interactional bedroom space conducive for dreams and leveling the sharp distinction between childhood and adulthood, it is also a spatial reminder of what is at stake, unsaid and unseen. The prepubescence or pre-adolescence of a girl whose body is on the verge of change, of the formation of a gender and sexual identity. A temple of the Holy Ghost sets up bodily materiality as more than what can be seen, even though there is a concerted effort to represent bodies in a visual mode. O'Connor presents the character only as the nameless child with fat cheeks and a mouthful of braces that glared like tin. The braces are a mechanism for moving teeth out of childhood misalignment and into the positionality of adulthood. The child is 12 years old and on the cusp of a physical movement from one phase of life to the other. It is that unacknowledged space of change, including the bodily hormonal, that O'Connor deals with in a cryptic and even hesitant way. Perhaps she's attempting to imitate Carson McCullers in her portrayal of Frankie in A Member of the Wedding. Perhaps it is her effort to explore what Bruce Henderson in God Made Me This Awake, queer perspectives in Flannery O'Connor labeled in today's critical parlance as queer in the representation of the child. Certainly, in the child's other dream, reconfiguring and revisioning the scene of the man-woman speech at the fair, there is the placement of the body as a distortion or contortion. Rather than only the differently able, O'Connor displays bodies as dysfunctional body, which at times is represented as gender dysfunction with a frame slippage occurring between masculine and feminine geographies of the body. I think there's a whole lot of dissatisfaction with physical body in by O'Connor. Tuan turns to the issue of dissatisfaction in regard to escaping or altering the human body. Quote, at an everyday social level, dissatisfaction is not with the body as such, but rather with its imperfections as measured by the standards of the time. At a deeper level, dissatisfaction may be directed at the body simply because it is an animal body, with often offensive odors and fluids, humors, and imperious biological demands, close quote. This recognition leads Tuan to further posit on corporeal grossness. Quote, no matter how comely in its own way, the body can still be an embarrassment, a reminder that our reach towards some more elevated state called human or spiritual is tenuous, hostage to the soar order of Thadious. Paradoxically, this very awareness of being an animal makes us human, close quote. He suggests that to bolster our self-esteem, we humans turn our gaze on the animal self of others, but frequently, he adds, quote, embarrassed by animality, we fellow humans, co-conspirators, cover it up, escape into a world of cultural creations that reassure us of our exceptionalism, close quote. Consider that religious martyrdom is what the child in the Temple of the Holy Ghost lands on for her exceptionalism. She began to prepare for her martyrdom, seeing herself in a pair of tights in a great arena lit by the early Christians hanging in cages of fire, making a gold dusty light that fell on her and the lions. The first lion charged forward and fell at her feet, converted. A whole series of lions did the same. The lions liked her so much she even slept with them, and finally the Romans were obliged to burn her, but to their astonishment, she would not burn down, and finally, finding she was so hard to kill, they finally cut off her head and very quickly, and she went immediately to heaven. She rehearsed this several times, returning each time at the entrance of paradise to the lions. In the end, with a clear delineation of spaces for containment, she accepts her extraordinary kinship with the lions, animals, rather than enter the spiritual realm of heaven with her exceptional corporeality. The cultural script that she engages is profoundly rooted in the visual spaces associated historically with early Christians painted against the place backdrop of the Romans in a Colosseum. Rather than hesitancy, she exhibits choice repeatedly, and with it, the chosen mutual space of familiarity, communion, and sociability. She does not only tame the lions, but converts them, so that in the end she shares more with them than with either the known Romans or the unknown paradise. At the same time, the dream is an imaginative leap into a spatial future and to the prospect of speculative fictions to come. The dream sequence occurs out of the child's interrelatedness with both events and people around her. They form a cultural expression and extension of her social being. Practices of sociability may open a window, as Tuan suggested, as a nonlinear progression towards elaborate forms of art and artifice that follow, quote from Tuan, twists and turns, because that is how our consciousness and feelings work, by twists and turns. It follows that in a reading of A Good Man is Hard to Find, it is plausible to consider the misfit's self-explanation of his origins as an expression of his sense of exceptionalism in relation to other humans and his compression of language into a small utilitarian space that coincides with his increasingly minimal human movements. The misfit says, "My daddy said I was a different breed of dog from my brothers and sisters. You know," Daddy said, "it's some that can live their whole life without asking about it, and it's others has to know why it is. And this boy is one of the latters. He's going to be into everything." Functioning as a different breed of dog leads the misfit to reveal an extraordinary list of his being into everything. "I was a gospel singer for a while. I've been most everything. Been in the armed service, both land and sea, at home and abroad. Been twixt married, been an undertaker, been with the railroads, plowed Mother Earth, been in a tornado, seen a woman burnt alive once. I even seen a woman flogged." What he has quickly drifted into is moving from what he has seen from an active participant in relations to an observer seeing things happen. The misfit makes clear that he is a different breed of dog. Interactions with others in spaces that should configure interrelatedness result instead in his extraordinary acceptance of animality, his exceptionalism, and his human distance from those others in both emotion and conscience. In Parker's Back, however, it is the turning of the human body itself into a cultural creation in order to ensure its exceptionalism. The body itself may be read as a site of inscription in specific modes of subjectivity, according to Elizabeth Gross. Parker offers both a marked body and an emphasis on visuality for consideration of the innately human and complicated subjectivity. Covering the body with tattoos is a way not only of disguising animality, but also of elevating the human body to a work of art, cultural creation. Parker is hostage to the sour order of Thadious, as Swan put it in asserting the paradoxical human awareness of being animal. But Parker is also hostage to his wife's refusal to recognize the art not only on Parker's body, but the art that is his human body. His wife recognizes the animality and the craven aspects of humanity that Parker tries to escape in transcending the human body and attempting to reach a physical and spiritual alignment with the image of God on his back. "Another picture," Sarah Ruth growled. "I might have known you was off putting some more trash on yourself." Parker attempts to get her to recognize God inked on his back, but she is adamant. God don't look like that," and he tries to counter her. "What do you know how he looks?" Parker moaned. "You ain't seen him," and she replies. "He don't look. He's a spirit. No man shall see his face." Parker's insistent that it is just a picture of him further enrages Sarah Ruth, who screams, "Idolatry, inflaming yourself with idols under every green tree. I can put up with lies and vanity, but I don't want no idolater in this house." She sees his body as a violation of the house as a sacred place, able to contain some sins but not idolatry. Shocked by the rejection of his corporal gift and by his expulsion from physically shared and human constructed place, he puts up no resistance to her beating him with the broom and causing welts to form on the tattooed face of Christ, and lands in the open and uncertain exterior space back in nature. For all the language of sight, seeing, and looking, Parker and Sarah Ruth are both blind and lacking vision. Neither can comprehend that social practices can create a compassionate, interrelated humanity, and neither can recognize a constitutive interrelatedness that would ameliorate their singular and separate focus on exceptionalism. He retreats as wounded and uncomprehending as an animal and reduced from his manhood. Quote, "There he was who called himself Obadiah Elihu, leaning against a tree, crying like a baby. Parker's wife, of course, who is so mired in sniffing out all human flaws or sins, can only comprehend the visualization as idolatry and looks out at the crying man without compassion and with, quote, eyes hardened still more, close quote. His body is a plea for touch, connection, and intimacy, closeness, and touch from another human being, none of which his wife, in her own unacknowledged hunger and need, is capable of giving. The body and its environs, Elizabeth Gross points out in Body Cities, quote, produce each other as forms of the hyperreal, as modes of simulation which have overtaken and transformed whatever reality each may have had unto the image of the other. Parker assumed Sarah Ruth's odd religiosity into his corporeal body, and she reverts to the animal body she envisions his to be. This final view of Parker's wife echoes her description in the opening of the story, which foreshadows O'Connor's emphasis on the human body's problematic material physicality and especially the hardening of sight. Quote, she was plain, the skin on her face was thin and drawn as tight as the skin of an onion, and her eyes were gray and sharp like the points of two ice picks, close quotes. Her bodily flaws, or the labeled ugliness, somehow attract him as much as her personality flaws that he identifies. But her physical flaws speak to his own body, the geography closest in, as Adrian Rich describes the body. Parker has colored his tattoos in an attempt to be visible and colorful as a tattooed man he modeled his body after. Similarly, the final narrative sequence with the broom-wielding echoes Parker's initial encounter with the girl who would become his wife in the yard of the house, when, after pretending to have injured his hand inspecting the motor of his truck in order to get her attention, he curses, Jesus Christ in hell, Jesus, God, almighty damn, God damn it to hell. The result is startling. Quote, without warning, a terrible bristly claw slammed the side of his face and he fell backward on the hood of the truck. You don't talk no filth here, a voice close to him shrilled. Parker's vision was so blurred that for an instant he thought he had been attacked by some creature from above, a giant hawk-eyed angel wielding a hoary weapon. As his sight cleared, he saw before him a tall, raw-boned girl with a broom. In this instance, the brief melding of the girl with a hawk-eyed angel wielding a hoary weapon places her both within and above the animal category. Parker's own blurred vision is an initial fleeing it is an initial fleeing from the problem of sight and seeing in the narrative. It is a reminder that throughout O'Connor's fiction, words describing characters often function like captions in the cartoon, sharp and incisive, compressed and humorous, but always with the often dark dimensions that are not easily grasped. Further, Parker may well be a character conceived out of O'Connor's visualization of Popeye, the sailor man from animated cartoons. In a sense, the dehumanization of human bodies in O'Connor's drawings and later in her stories is an acceptance of the innate animality of humans. Yet, as Tuan concedes, quote, dehumanization does not and cannot mean that the return to a prior state of innocent animality. Rather, the process ends in the conjuration of monsters, either human or animal, whose real reason for existence is to stimulate titillation in private and more sinisterly to declare to the world that that is what human beings truly are, inconsequential and grotesque, close quote. There is, however, always and at the same time, the human resistance to such viable reductions, as O'Connor repeatedly depicts. There is that ever-possible and often present striving for transcendence and spirituality, aligning with the higher power outside of the human flawed self, and yet residing within, and sometimes with only opaque longings visualized in natural world imagery. At the end of a temple of the Holy Ghost, for instance, the child leans out of the car window and, quote, looked out over a stretch of pasture land that rose and fell with a gathering greenness until it touched the dark woods. The sun was a huge red ball like an elevated host drenched in blood, and when it sank out of sight, it left a line in the sky like a red clay road hanging over the trees, quote, close quote. This visualization, this seeing, the elevating of the child's often flawed vision and equating it with transubstantiation redeems the worldly space and transforms the vehicle carrying the corporeal animalistic body into a space following the line in the sky where the where the host-like sun has appeared and disappeared. But there is another formulation of transubstantiation, that is, the change in substance but not in appearance, functioning on the symbolic level. In the imagery of gathering greenness, touching the dark woods and the drenched in blood, there is also the metaphorical reverberation of the child's material body on the verge of menses. The space of O'Connor's cosmos intersects here with the bodily spaces she has explored throughout the narrative. 3. O'Connor's representation of body, one of the 3 categories of spatial structures, is distinct both in her narratives and in her drawings. In drawing the material bodies in her own cartoons, O'Connor seized upon 2 prominent aspects of comic strips, cartoons and animation, rubber hose style and exaggerated facial features. Her drawings and liner cuts from her student days depicted bodies with elongated Pinocchio-like noses and oddly shaped figures. These set the stage for representing dysfunction that morphs into her later fictional portraiture. The oddly shaped figures also suggest visually how bodies are regulated by culturally produced technologies of power. The incongruous shapes or misshapen bodies in her cartoons often defy gravity, as in one cartoon with the long-nosed, exaggerated, eyebrowed student burdened with a suitcase labeled GSCW and a towering armload of books with an umbrella tucked in declares, term papers add quite a lot to these Thanksgiving holidays. That cartoon from the Colonnade, the student newspaper, tells a lot. Even more striking is the cartoon image with the sign bookstore in the background, and in the foreground an assemblage of bodies all twisted in an indistinguishable mad tumble of parts, legs, feet, heads, skirts, and faces. Cartoons also from the Colonnade. One of the happiest of this type of exaggerated cartoons is of a huge eye, pointed nose, mouth full of teeth girl gleefully, aloft high in the air in a gravity-defying leap with 4 earthbound girls smile, while 4 earthbound girls, file their approval, as she says, "It breaks my heart to leave for the whole summer." The rubber hose refers to an early animation practice in which limbs move in super-extended and flexible ways so that legs or arms resemble rubber hoses. The distortion of the human or animal body, and I think the one back had more examples of rubber hose. The distortion of the human or animal body into exaggerated, elongated limbs or catapulting eyeballs or 360-degree twisted necks was intended to evoke laughter from instantly recognizable humorous forms. One example that O'Connor uses let's see, I'm gonna go. Yeah, that one. Of a rubber hose is quite striking. A girl's eyes pop out like long tubes following two boys walking in the opposite direction. In the caption, one woman, completely unaware of the rubberized eyeballs trailing the boys, says to another woman, "Isn't it fortunate that Genevieve has completely escaped that boy-crazy stage?" The cartoon, dependent on the rubber hose technique, is an excellent example of the visual compression of a larger message in the combination of the drawing itself and the pointed caption. O'Connor's drawing of bodies suggests another of her comic influences, Jimmy Durante, who may have escaped Gerald's notice. Durante, 1893-1980, was a Catholic comedian, musician, and vaudeville radio, film, and television personality whose voice and nose approximation of his highly identifiable physical appearance and distinctive voice became part of animated films, including Tom and Jerry. Known for his long, large nose and his raspy voice, Durante was popular in multimedia forums from the 1920s through the 1970s, but especially a comic sensation in the 1930s and 40s with a quite identifiable contribution to animated films. He was often depicted and alluded to by his voice in his by his voice or his catchphrases in cartoons such as Soda Squirt, Turkey Jerky, Turkey, and Tom and Jerry. Book review, a 1946 Looney Tune cartoon featuring Daffy Duck from Warner Brothers shows Durante turning sideways so that his big nose extends out like a rubber hose trick to trip a fleeing criminal. The nose is obviously one of the prominent features of O'Connor's cartoons. See, for example, the sleeping figure represented in Music Appreciation Hath Charms, also from the Peabody Palladium. O'Connor's varying representations of large noses, long noses, and pointed noses are all part of an identifiable arsenal of visual techniques in her comic depictions of the body in relational networks. At once rebelling against hierarchical authority and leaving open possible futures, the readable figures O'Connor draws encompass socially encoded meanings that take their cue from the tricks visualized in animated cartoons to tell stories. O'Connor's writing depends very much upon visual interrelationships that tell stories. In Parker's Back, for instance, Parker attempts to escape from his body and into a disguised body that resembles a tattooed man he once saw at a fair who appeared, quote, patterned in a single intricate design of brilliant color, or, quote, an arabesque of men and beasts and flowers on his skin. The sight that had filled a 14-year-old Parker with such emotion that lifted up some people as when the flag passes, and a peculiar unease settled on him. It was as if a blind boy had turned so gently in a different direction that he did not know his destination had been changed, close quote. Forgoing his given name for only initials OE, he flattens his identity to a dimensionality that reflects his reduced sense of himself and his elevated emotional attraction to the colorful human tattooed body. While putting in 5 years in the Navy, he, quote, seemed a natural part of the gray mechanical ship, except for his eyes, which were the same pale slate color as the ocean and reflected the immense spaces around him as if they were a microcosm of the mysterious sea. Close quote. Despite the topographical imbrication of man and machine, the eyes register the immensity of the space and assume the mystery of the sea. Each new tattoo becomes a sign of his attempt at increased visibility and to recapture the emotion he felt first seeing the tattooed man. But the objects he draws from an eagle on a cannon, a serpent above a shield, hearts, arrows, a spread hand of cars, only paint his body as outside of significant human interactions. Eventually, he shifted from, quote, lifeless tattoos like anchors and cross rifles and began adorning his body with animals. Quote, he had a tiger and panther on each shoulder, a cobra coiled about a torch on his chest, hawks on his thighs. Parker suffers from a lack of intimacy, even though he has visually offered his tattooed body as an attraction, as a way of attracting women. Aligned with the tattooed man, Parker visually bears a disguise of the material, physical human body, turning it not into a work of art, but into an inscripted animality. The space of the human gives way to the animal, but the human has needs and desires beyond the animalistic that reach towards story. Hunger is a descriptive metaphor in the forefront of the narrative. At 16 in the Navy, Parker's, quote, mouth ceased to hang open, close quote. But he is not satiated. Hunger is at the core of Parker's and his wife's malaise, physical and emotional hunger, perverted into a religious narrowing down of the sensual aspects of life. He searches for acceptance, for the embrace, and for the affection of interrelationships. A telltale sign is his tattooed of a married couple, Elizabeth II and Philip, over where his stomach and liver were, respectively. For her part, all becomes the sniffing out of sin and transgression, but the unspoken need for more is ever present and disturbs her and his ability to experience human pleasure. Parker's own male body, his back ultimately, is a story, and the exaggeration of all the misshapen figures that would appear in cartoons, such as Popeye. The difference is that Parker is endowed with feelings, though the affective meaning is lost on him. O'Connor's connoting of his eyes with the mysterious sea at once alludes to the breadth and depth of the unreadable spaces surrounding and engulfing him. It is also a scripting of a visual geography in a spatial story. Simultaneously, the delineation of his wife's narrow spirituality and righteous disapproval appears in one spectacular secular instance of a variant of the rubber hose cartoon technique on the exaggerated expression of parts of the human body. Sarah Ruth displays her disapproval of automobiles in a specific way. Quote, the house they rented sat alone, save for a single tall pecan tree on a high embankment overlooking a highway. At intervals, a car would shoot past below, and his wife's eyes would swerve suspiciously after the sound of it. Her swerving eyes, a retroactive gesture emblematic of rubber hose and its comic effect, reference that she has little cognitive understanding of the use value of automobiles, of vehicles, and even less visual comprehension of how vehicles, trucks, tractors, ships are conveyances of her husband's visual cartography and story. O'Connor, however, sets about putting vehicles to good use as both spatial communication, story, and spatial movement, travel. She unfolds story by means of both spatial cartography and cartoon iconography, and utilizing the techniques adopted from her cartoons, containment, compression, along with delineation and representation in scripting visual geographies and spatial stories. Every story is a travel story, according to Michel de Certeau in The Practice of Everyday Life. In A Temple of the Holy Ghost, the roads of travel and the automobile forward character representation. Mr. Cheatham's car and Alonzo's taxi are vehicles of transportation and movement of the thematic and plot lines. But notice, too, that it is in the context of the automobile that a variety of linkages occur. One of them refers back to cartoon images and the confined visual space of the drawn comics. Quote, Miss Kirby was a long-faced blonde school teacher who boarded with them, and Mr. Cheatham was her admirer, a rich old farmer who arrived every Saturday afternoon in a 15-year-old baby blue Pontiac powdered with red clay dust and black inside with Negroes that he charged 10 cents apiece to bring them into town on Saturday afternoons, close quotes. Later in the story, the nameless mother laments of Miss Kirby's beau. He's her only friend, oh my Lord. That poor soul is so lonesome she'll even ride in that car that smells like the last circle of hell. The smelly, confined space of the car is intricately connected to class and race assumptions. Cheatham has already been described humorously. Quote, he was bald-headed except for a little fringe of rust-colored hair, and his face was nearly the same color as the unpaved roads and washed like them with ruts and gullies. He wore a pale green shirt with a thin black stripe in it, and blue galoshes, and his trousers cut across his protruding stomach that he pressed tenderly from time to time with his big flat thumb. All his teeth were lined with gold, close quote. As if Mr. Cheatham's comic physical description is insufficient, his car adds the extra narrative punch, and with it, a reduction of his human body to the car. While not animality, it nonetheless compresses the human into a different species of thing for the point of visual entertainment, of seeing the man and his car united into an object of derision. At the thought of the visiting teenage girls being shown around by Mr. Cheatham, the child doubled over laughing. She'd never thought of anything so funny before. And she's joined by her mother, who laughed in a guarded way. Disfiguration equals a casual way to establish social perspective and the experience of others. Caricature is refined and put into the service of exposing the strength or weakness of character. Ready flaws in others magnify the flaws of self, but an unwillingness to identify with others in the social realm pervades interaction, and connection is ultimately denied. At the same time, these scenes are a reminder, quote, that all spaces contain stories and must be recognized as the site of an ongoing struggle over meaning and value that, as Brian Jarvis suggested in echoing Michel de Certeau. In the travel story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, O'Connor maps space through interactions and interrelations, beginning with the enclosed living room of the home that the grandmother shares with her son Bailey, his wife, and their 3 children. The narrative coalesces around references to multiple geographical places, Florida, East Texas, implicated in potential vacation travel, but without any mappings of the geographical location of the home. The opening, however, maps a parallel, ominous journey toward Florida from a different starting point, an institutional rather than a domestic one, and a place of confinement, a federal penitentiary. The grandmother's argument against vacationing in Florida incorporates the existence of the criminal whose body, whose motion and mobility coincides with the family's plan. The gap between the escaped criminal on the loose and the seated grandmother in the automobile is clear in the commodification of her body. She's carefully outfitted herself for travel with, quote, a navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of white violets on the brim, and a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the print. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trimmed with lace, and at her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. By means of this compressed visualization, the grandmother becomes the object of her story of identity, and she deploys her clothed body to signify social position and her place in a larger social network, the class of lady. And here, the silent signifier is white. O'Connor uses succinct this is succinct description of identity not merely as commodification, but also to forecast a fate, another story. The foreshadowing of an accident and of death on the highway intersects with the grandmother's initial alarm at the newspaper story of what the escaped convict, the misfit, did to people. It is a way of making concrete Doreen Massey's observation that, quote, space is always under construction, a product of relations between, relations which essentially and necessarily are embedded material practices which have to be carried out, so that space is always in the process of being made. Perhaps imagine then space as simultaneously as a simultaneity of stories so far. In spatial terms, A Good Man is Hard to Find denotes the travel story and the space-containing story on two levels. In the one, it is a literal vacation trip to Florida. In the other, it is figuratively the misfits and the grandmothers traversing the spatial distance back in time that signifies a power struggle over meaning. The misfit statements about his father function as verbalizations of the descent into the past and its marked spaces that characterize the grandmother's misplaced memory of her past structures and their evocation of emotion. Both tread on dangerous affective grounds, leading inevitably to the misfit's denial of patricide, his denial of kinship with the grandmother, and his dismissive shooting of her, not in the wooded treed space hidden from sight, but visibly within the frame that has contained both the misfit and the grandmother. She was a talker. But notice that it is the misfit who does the talking in a script evoked by the grandmother. The tight focus of the frame is on the duet of prescribed masculinity and femininity. The misfit is queered from his own self-described life narrative. He handles the object in his hand, a gun, like a pointer, a marker, moving through the earth itself as he makes circles in the ground with it and, quote, feels not only its texture but its geometric properties. This quote is from Space and Place. The gun takes on properties that connect it at once to vastness and immediacy. It signifies the power held and exerted and the circularity of his travels. The misfit, unlike the grandmother, does not confuse his spatial awareness and cliches and clinches the immediate present with using his gun to shoot the grandmother in plain sight. He draws circles and completes a circular journey. Human spaces, quoting Tuan, reflect the quality of human senses and mentality. The mind frequently extrapolates beyond sensory evidence. The grandmother has been unable to perceive the vastness of Tennessee and Georgia, not because of different landscapes, but because she comprehends space in numerical symbols. A dirt road about a mile back, it's not much farther, or verbal symbols, an old plantation she had visited in this neighborhood once when she was a young lady. The grandmother recalled other points about the house, the beautiful glass over the front door and the candle lamp in the hallway. Both numerical and verbal symbols ultimately are derived from emotion, in her case, affective connection with the past, real or imagined. She had already remarked, "Look at the graveyard. That was the old family burying ground that belonged to the plantation." But when John Wesley asks, "Where's the plantation?" she replies, "Gone with the wind," and laughs. Nostalgia for place configured in the past is curiously undercut by the reality of the film reference, which in itself is a scripted visual reenactment of spaces and geographies that exist on the margins of reality in a nostalgic nod to an imaginative cosmos. And yet, as Foucault speculates about cemeteries, the graveyard is a heterotopia, both mythical and real, and whose meaning and purpose can change over time. There is ultimately, in the caption-like descriptives of O'Connor's stories, a reminder that Action or visibility in the foreground is only part of the whole. In the background is the workings of the affective unseen, whether psychological, spiritual, or emotional. The flat surface of visible space is just as often opaque. There is then an imperceptibility of the seen in O'Connor's stories that is perhaps akin to the ink blot background in some of her cartoons and to the blank white space in others. The prevalent assumption about her fiction is that there is something more there, but it is ultimately unclear or unseen and therefore open to interpretation and speculation, to interpretive guessing, often attributed to mystery in writings about O'Connor. The why and its unseen are hard to read, but the implications continue to be many and varied. I can imagine O'Connor standing in the margin, viewing her cosmos and articulating her sense of the world. This O'Connor maps the body and draws corporeal cartographies that frame visual spatiality and scripts spatial geographies, all of which displays to full advantage her distinctive subjectivity and her creative difference. You didn't fall asleep completely.
We have time for maybe one or two questions, because I know you're exhausted.
I told you it was a long haul here.
Speak now. Oh.
Just quickly, the expression "the past as a foreign country" or as another country has occurred to me during this program, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on how that might be applicable to helping students engage with O'Connor and travel to these spaces, so to speak.
I didn't hear the first part.
The quote, the past is another country, or the past is a foreign country, is just something that had occurred to me, and I wonder if you think it might have relevance to helping students enter into O'Connor's work.
I think that's something that you've obviously just made a connection to, and it might be something that that you could pursue with students. Yes. Short answer. I think it's a good strategy.
Do we have another?
The past as a country is a fascinating concept, though, when you begin to think about it. And when you think about placement and time in the same connective kind of tissue, it becomes a little complicated to sort out for students, I suspect. So, but it is a way, I think, of allowing them to enter into a particular way of thinking about O'Connor, or whoever that you might want to transpose that thought to.
Do we have another question?
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this talk. And when you put the cartoons on your slide and then started speaking through the elongated figures and the noses and what O'Connor's doing with space, I couldn't help thinking of modernist portraiture.
Of what?
Modernist portraiture of Picasso and Cubism, and
yes.
I have honestly never made this connection before right now, but so maybe I'm simply asking you to speculate, but I wonder if you think there might be anything that could be done with the way that O'Connor is breaking up and playing with and defamiliarizing spaces, the way you talked about, and the way that some of the modernist painters might have been.
You know, it's quite possible to think in terms of cubist distortions of bodies and parts and the animalistic qualities that often appear in that way. I'm not sure that a direct line can actually be made, but if you think about O'Connor as a visual artist, not just a cartoonist, but someone who could also paint portraits, do other types of artistic work, there may very well be a way in which her seeing is taking into account a lot more than we normally think of her taking into account. I mean, I think it's very significant that we've begun to look at those early drawings more carefully and just consider what kinds of interrelationships they might have with the writing. Avenues that you might explore in terms of cubism may lead to dead ends, but they may not. But you know, that's the way in which our intellectual curiosity works, and often will lead us to conclusions and ways of putting things together that had not initially occurred to us or to other people. So it can be sort of breakthroughs that might be possible. But at first thought, you can think it's a sort of a stretch, but the stretch following through might lead you someplace that could be of great interest.
I'll make this quick. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for your talk. It's Matt. I'm back here. First, I just wanted to I was thinking of two sort of animation and cartoon pieces that could go along with some of what you're saying, too. One is Winsor McKay's Little Nemo in Slumberland. And I hadn't thought about this until you were talking about Temple of the Holy Ghost and her sort of dreamscape in that story. And the way that he animates dreams is really fascinating in terms of the rubber hose style. The other one I was thinking about is Plastic Man, 1941 superhero that comes out, which wouldn't have been popular when she was a kid, but might have been even popular when she was at Iowa or whatever. So those are two sort of like comic animating things that I thought were kind of interesting to think about alongside what you were saying. A question I kind of have, it's maybe a deceptively complex one, but if you were going to teach O'Connor now, how would you approach it this way with students? Talk about spatiality and talking about these sorts of things, or is there some other sort of approach you would take?
Well, yeah, I would approach it through exactly this way of thinking about her, because, and this is something that I couldn't really develop very carefully for you in this talk, but I really see O'Connor not as a modernist at all, but rather as a postmodern writer. And if you notice, repeatedly some critics tend to point out her quarrel with modernism or her distinctiveness from other modernists. And in so doing, they get at the distinctiveness about her, a contrarian kind of aspect, or her focus on certain kinds of land-related issues. It's a kind of interesting list of aspects, and that she's never interested in placing into her fiction grand narratives. And grand narratives were extraordinarily significant for modernist authors in some way or another, one way or another, even though we can point to the religious implications and spirituality and all of those kinds of things. But she's functioning always at a kind of oppositional way in which she approaches her time and place. And for that reason, it seems to me that she is much more in line with what we consider postmodernism than modernism. So there may be a way in which you can start repositioning her into another kind of cohort. It doesn't matter her death date, but what matters is the context of her fiction. And here I'm trying to exclude her prose writings that direct us in particular ways of thinking about her and so on. I mean, yes, some of that might be applicable, but I think another kind of investigation might move her out of the strange alignment, forced alignment with modernist, and into another kind of alignment. And this may also be an answer to what your question was about Picasso and Cubism and so on. You know, you may want to think about her outside of that kind of contextual box, because she's always standing somehow apart and purposely and consciously separating herself from many of her contemporaries, whom I think she clearly models some of her work on, although she may denigrate them. So it's an interesting way in which you might begin to think of O'Connor in other terms that might then relate to some of what, you know, it's extraordinarily interesting to me to think about what it means to come of age in her particular era, and all of the kinds of innovations for a visually oriented person. You know, what did all of that mean, and why did she so often stand outside? Is it just because of the particular aspects of her illness in her mature writing years? Or is it something else? Can we look back and see her developing from an earlier age, a misalignment with much that she supposedly should have been in alignment with, but what obviously wasn't? And it's I think especially evident in the cartoons and her approaches to gender in a college of women, really antagonistic towards those others. And it's a kind of odd thing, because usually in that kind of situation, there is a sense of really close community, a close kind of alignment. But that just becomes for me one example of the ways in which she will often be positioned as oddly outside and not quite fitting these patterns that are associated with modernism. But you see it evident in evidence in other ways in her work from early on. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
For those outside of the NEH, Dr. Davis has had to do really difficult work today. She's had seminars in the morning, in the afternoon, and giving this lecture tonight. So we promised we would not run the question and answer.
Well, I forewarned you that it was a long paper, and you have been very good in sitting through and listening to all of it. So I appreciate that very much. And if there is any pressing question that you really want to ask, I'm not averse to hearing it and attempting an answer. I'm not very good often at answering these complicated and intricate questions. So.
I think we're going to let you off the hook. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. You were patient.